Okay, I'd like to speak a little bit about downzonings because that was another crucial work we did. So many neighborhoods had been upzoned, meaning that they were allowed to have denser development. So we were seeing this continual erosion of neighborhoods, particularly around the downtown area. So we began working with neighborhood associations to downzone neighborhoods so that the single-family dwellings would be protected. And those were difficult, and it took a lot of walking the street. And in fact, I have a son who always refers to spending his weekends flyering the neighborhood and reminding me that flyering is not a verb, Mom. And many, many times he went out with his friends, because I paid them, and put flyers by front door so that they could show up at the planning commission or the what commission to push and to urge the commission to downzone a neighborhood. So I think, again, that was some of our crucial early work in protecting neighborhoods. And I also have always said, as far as the neighborhood movement is concerned, that when the preservationists and the neighborhoods associations joined force, it was a win, because that was usually a lot of people that would come out.
And out of that effort of working with the neighborhoods, the surveys, then the downzoning efforts, the growth of neighborhood organizations, eventually we all sat down and said, how can we just put some tools in place so that neighborhoods that want to preserve themselves can take action without sort of an outside influence? And the whole concept of the landmark district really came to the fore with our then planning director, Terry Tornek, was a visionary in that regard. And we sat on the floor in our office. I remember eating pizza saying, you know, what could we do? What could we do? And the idea of a landmark district, which would essentially start with the neighborhood. We want to be a protected historic district and bring themselves to the city, organized in that way with a common vision for their own neighborhood. And that legislation actually passed fairly quietly because the city council then was much more worried about the downzoning effort and wasn't paying as much attention to this new ordinance to create landmark districts. And I think it took 10 years to get one landmark district, but now there are 21 landmark districts in Pasadena. So it was a very successful tool, and it was actually born at Pasadena Heritage over pizza.
Well, the Preservation Fund was begun in 1979, and at that point we felt that we were organized enough and that we could set up a preservation fund and do projects our very own self. And the first project that we embarked upon was the Easton House, which was a house on South Marengo, a craftsman house. And we bought the house and restored it and used it for restoration workshops and a number of other purposes, and then sold it. That was the first of several projects that we were involved in.
We had a historic garage. It was also part of the original design and construction by Louis B. Easton. One of the things that we had to do was to move the garage. So I had the idea, well, if we got the garage ready to be moved, and we had the coincidence of some Pasadena Heritage event. I don't recall if it was a walking tour of the South Marengo Historic District or something, but we had plenty of beer and other refreshments, and we invited strong backs, strong arms from the people that went on the tour to meet us at the Easton House at or near the end of the tour. And there must have been 30 men or so, and maybe some women, who then got inside of the garage, and we lifted it up and moved it incrementally till we got to this new place, which I think may have already poured a new concrete slab for.
Yeah, it was all ready.
And of course, always the great hurrahs when we finally planted it on its new location. But that was probably close to the end of all the other renovation efforts that had gone into the Easton House.
I think that's right. And Terry Tornek was then the development director in the city, and it was he who came up with the overlay zone, which protected the other craftsman buildings and bungalow courts along South Marengo. Because in those days that street was wide, the zoning was such that you could tear down all those buildings and build condos, and little by little we were seeing that happen. But as a result of our working on the Easton House, we interested other developers in coming in and restoring their homes, and they could restore them and use them for low-use office building And to this day, when I drive down South Marengo, I remember that because that street wouldn't be as it is today
But-
without those efforts.
What came first, the overlay or Pasadena Heritage
I think we
writing
came
the
first.
National Register nomination?
I think we came first in doing a National Register
Right.
nomination, but Terry Tornick then came up with the idea of the overlay zone so that all the other buildings could be restored as well. And then almost immediately, they all were purchased and
Right.
restored. And they all had been in very, very poor condition.
So with our National Register nomination, we actually had to demonstrate the boundaries that would be appropriate for this
Right.
district, and that coincided then with the later zoning overlay.
You know, another fun story on South Marengo, when we were researching that little district to put it on the National Register, was that we discovered that Mrs. C's Candy, Mrs. C's of Mrs. C's Candy, her son actually lived in one of the houses, and she lived with him in her senior years, and he thought she was the best candy maker ever, and eventually persuaded her to go into business with him to sell her candy. But that house was sort of the test kitchen and where Mrs. C actually was creating her early recipes. And we were able to tell the C's Candy people about that, and it's now known as Mrs. C's house.
Yeah.
And another thing that really came out of that South Marengo effort, I think, was raising all the money initially for the preservation fund. It was a number of banks and financial institutions,
And the State Office of Historic Preservation gave us a grant for $50,000,
which was a fortune.
which was a fortune.
And
us.
then when the Easton House was sold, that money went back into the preservation
Preservation
fund
fund.
to be used again. The concept of a historic preservation easement was on our radar. The easement tax benefit helped people who bought these houses and turned them into their offices. They could then benefit with a tax write-off for some of the restoration cost. So there was a whole confluence of benefits suddenly for dealing properly with historic buildings, and it was also the beginning of our preservation
Fund.
easement program and our preservation fund.
In the case of the Preservation Fund, and if I remember correctly, I don't know what any other preservation organizations, at least in California at that time, had anything like that. And the closest was the Historic Preservation Group in Salt Lake City. And so we invited
That's
their
right.
executive director down,
Stephanie Churchill.
Stephanie Churchill. I remember sitting on the floor in
That's
the
right, I
Easton
remember
House
too.
talking about the ins and outs of developing a preservation fund.
That's right.
And with that little bit of incentive and information, we went forward.
I did it. You're right. Forgotten that. Guards Court was a project that occurred in 1985, and an office developer, Montgomery Engineering, was going to demolish the bungalow court on its property to make way for an addition to its office building. This is on North Madison, just above Walnut. And we decided over a beer at a restaurant in Old Pasadena that we should just move that court. So with Terry's blessing, Linda Dishman, who now heads up LA Conservancy, who was then working for the city of Pasadena, and I were sort of put on notice that we were to do this by Terry Dornick. So we moved the bungalow court over to a site that had been owned by the city and was a vacant parcel over on North Pasadena Avenue. It was a bit of a struggle to get the people in the neighborhood to accept the fact that we were bringing in a bungalow court into their neighborhood. And I can assure you that when those 5 buildings came down the street in the middle of the night, they were not happy neighbors because the buildings looked pretty grim. But we had contractors on the site the next day, and the buildings were all restored, and Stefanos Polizordias was our architect. That's when I first met him. And we added little enclosed backyards to each of the bungalows, and then sold it off in the affordable housing moderate income range. The smaller units went for $70,000. The next sized units, which had 2 bedrooms, went for $80,000, and the larger ones which also had 2 bedrooms, went for $90,000. And we sold them basically by lottery, as long as you met the requirements for affordability. And it was truly one of the most exciting projects I personally have ever worked on, and providing housing is a real thrill. And I used to always say that whenever I'm in a low mood, if I drive by Guards Court, because it still looks beautiful, I always smile and I'm in a good mood.
Well, and I think it highlights too this interesting tension that we sometimes hear between historic preservation and affordable housing. And actually in Pasadena, it's been the historic preservation projects led by Pasadena Heritage and then in more recent years, Heritage Housing Partners, that have done some of the most successful and best affordable housing projects in the city of Pasadena, and really showed how older housing stock, in some people's eyes in terrible disrepair and not worthy of saving, actually can become prized home ownership opportunities for people who couldn't otherwise afford it. The next project we did was much smaller. It was the Charlotte Perkins Gilman house. And there's some controversy about whether that famous person, Charlotte Perkins Gilman, was an early feminist. She had roots in Pasadena. She went off to travel the countryside, eventually came back to Pasadena where she died. And we believe this was the last house she lived in. That's at least the urban legend. And it too was endangered, and we moved it and to a city-owned lot. So this was partnering with the city, which became critical to the success. And it was sold to a low-income family, and just is a charming little Victorian structure in the Lincoln Triangle area. And while we were doing those hands-on projects, we also had 2 different rounds of grant programs for the neighborhoods in which we were working.
Okay.
Where we raised some money and accessed some CDBG money from the city and used those dollars to help other homeowners in those neighborhoods to paint or repair their roofs or do porch repairs, so that we were actually impacting the neighborhood and helping other residents, as well as bringing an old house into their neighborhood, which sometimes was a little bit shaky. So a lot of partnering went on and a lot of good work was done using the Preservation Fund, city resources, and working with neighborhoods and creating affordable housing. So we should be really proud of that.
That was fun.
The building was threatened with certain owners that wanted to sell the property to the highest bidder for redevelopment. And somehow that was staved off, and there was a start towards moving forward to attack it from another perspective. National Register nomination was prepared and submitted, and having a building listed on the National Register was a requirement for
That's right.
being considered for one of these state grants. And so one thing led to another, to another, to another.
And we received a grant from the Office of Historic Preservation for $683,000.
The largest, or one of the largest ever funded through one of those programs.
It was funded actually through a bond issue, and there was some portion of this state bond issue that was set aside for historic preservation. So we applied for a grant under that, and we were successful. So we did a complete historic structures report, and then we restored the south facade, which overlooks Central Park. But that was all that our money would do. But then Castle Green owners had a plan and a program as a result of our work that they could go forward with, and they, to this day, it's my understanding, follow this. And so little by little, they have continued the work that we started. And it was another successful project with large thanks to the Office of Historic Preservation.
And maybe the frosting on the cake was that because we applied for the grant and oversaw the work and hired the contractors sort of as the leadership team on the project with people from the castle, we also requested and accepted a historic preservation easement on the castle. So any future work to the exterior of the building requires Pasadena Heritage's review and approval. So that gave us, for the investment that we were able to bring to the project, sort of a permanent place at the table for the Castle Green's future. So that's a nice end of that story.
Again, another award-winning project.
Yet another
It was.
award-winning project.